Welcome everybody to the 7th edition of the office hours for the Real World Finance core unit. We are here with a number of the usual suspect participants in this call, and today today we were thinking about bringing forward some of the discussions that happened like as part of the call, the focus on call on self-contained applications. Don't have a presentation, but it's actually more I guess a topic that probably didn't have as much time to cover in a lot of depth during the conversation. And other than that, also open for the participants that are in the call to bring any topics, questions, concerns that they may have and that they want to discuss with the team. So actually, it's really an open forum for AMAs with the team. In the room here, we've got present from the team, Eric, Christian, and myself. Okay, Christian or Eric, do you guys actually wanted to bring over? I think there was one last slide as a kind of like as a kickoff for our conversation from the presentation that you did on. I think it was actually TradFi versus DeFi. Or structured financing DeFi applications. I think from the call last week, I think there was one of the last slides was already was touching on the point of MIP self-contained application as kind of like a starter.
Christian, do you have that at your fingertips? I'm trying to find it and not doing well.
No, I don't. I mean, I think. I mean, I mean, we can talk about the self-contained MIPs and how certainly how I can't say how we approach them. I can say how I approach them from a review standpoint. I mean, I think so. When you tell me when you find it, but I guess from a self-contained MIP, I think the idea was that these MIPs are there's a MIP6 process, right? So we have a MIP6 process that has now supplemented by MIP67. Defines what it is that applicants should be submitting in order for not only our team, but really the community to gauge whether or not the opportunity that's being presented is one of interest, and two, frankly, more importantly, is the applicant organized professionally enough to justify everybody's time and effort. And part of the MIP67 upgrade, if you will, is to really just to get applicants to be more focused, because the early MIPs were very, 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 very weak, and this was a way in a way to a tool to weed out just people who want to throw a MIP together just to see, engage the community, get a green light vote, and then waste sometimes our time, community's money in chasing down things. And what we've said is, look, if you want us to take you seriously, then you need to take yourself seriously and put together something that's a bit more comprehensive. The MIP, self-contained MIPs then come on board, which was all fine, and they were a bit more complete. But we had a question as to, well, what happens when you have a self-contained MIP? Because we had been used to dealing with the MIP6 process where it's green-lit and then we work on it and then do a risk assessment. And all of a sudden we have these MIPs that are outside of the system that we've been accustomed to working. So we kind of said to ourselves, well, there was a bit of a debate. Well, do you do anything? I mean, is it even, do we even have a responsibility as the real world finance team to do anything? And we said, well, probably. We should probably at least take a look at them and comment on them. And then say, okay, well, what do the MIP self-contained MIPs actually say, and how do we comment on them? And I think our view was, well, if they're self-contained MIPs, they've been put into the community for community engagement. Okay, let's put all our questions and observations and comments to the best of our ability based on the information that's been provided to date, and identify the issues so that the community can be more fully informed, simply because once these MIPs get approved, then it's like, what happens next, right? So if you have a MIP that's been approved, are we then supposed to go back and work on it? Well, I mean, the whole point of a MIP was it should be, in some sense, self-contained, right? It should be complete. And I think the slide that Will is referring to was, this is just a thought. I mean, if you're going to do a self-contained MIP and you as an applicant want the community to vote in favor of it, and it is voted in favor, and you don't want them to have to go back to the real world finance group to then actually have a discussion as to what are all the details, because I mean that's ends up what you would end up doing. So these self-contained MIPs then become MIP6s, just maybe a little more developed. Well, if you want to avoid that whole process, the best thing for you to do is, frankly, send us a self-contained MIP that includes all the transaction documents. I mean, every transaction document. So if there's a pledge agreement, have the full pledge agreement. If there's a loan agreement, have the full loan agreement. I mean, I'll review a loan agreement. I've reviewed loan agreements for 25 years. I don't have a problem looking at that loan agreement. And that way, we can comment on it. 2, you can look professional. And 3, most importantly, then you don't have to go back to real world finance afterwards. Because if the community votes in favor of your self-contained MIP, and that self-contained MIP includes all the agreements, then there's no work really to be done. We can actually make a recommendation based on a full, complete set of documents. But right now, half the time we're being asked to make a recommendation based on certainly not documentation, and sometimes incomplete proposals. So that was kind of the idea, on that last slide, is just basically saying, well, if you're going to do a self-contained MIP, and you want to avoid the process of having the real world finance team work with you through identifying agreements and so on and so forth, well, put all the agreements out there and make it as complete as possible. Because ultimately, you as the applicant, we're going to turn to you for the documents anyway. So we don't have the resources ourselves to prepare the agreements. And we're going to turn to you to do the agreements. So when you also have that prioritization language in the self-contained MIPs, which was in there, it's doubly bad, because if you haven't proposed a self-contained MIP that includes all the agreements, well, then all the other deals that are been greenlit or in process actually get delayed while you're preparing your documentation. And, as everybody on this call will know, it's the documentation that takes the longest time. And it's the documentation that usually slows things down. So if you want an accelerated process and you want a process that's fair, give us all the documents up front. Now, you're going to have to spend some money on that, but that's not kind of our problem. Sure. I mean, if you want to go down this pathway, give us something that we can work with. So
Christian,
I think that was the last point.
I think that's a great point, set of points. I think the self-contained MIPs, at least tell you from my perspective, are quite naive. Because at the end of the day, most financing agreements are hundreds, if not thousands, of pages of documents that are signed and are agreed upon and negotiated by both parties. So if someone comes up with 8 or 10 pages of stuff on the forum as a self-contained MIP, I mean, it's woefully inadequate. Does it cover 10% of the material points that need to be decided? I don't think so. I mean, maybe it covers 10%, but the challenge is, how does the community going to vote on that if there's 90% plus more material issues to be addressed? So if it passes with the 10% approved, then who the hell knows what comes next? I actually wanted one of them to pass. I think it'd be a fantastic teachable moment, because then we'd have like this slow motion train wreck, and we say, okay, community, this passed. Do you want the borrowers to write all the documents? So every point not covered, the borrowers write whatever the hell they want. And you could do that. And if you want to do that, Christian and I are coming for a $10 billion deal tomorrow, by the way. And we're going to do it. Two, do you want us to kind of just list every point that we have concerns with, where we think it's not fair to Maker, and then the community can negotiate literally hundreds of points in the forum? That's certainly a way you can go. I think it doesn't really work, but, or you could like maybe empower us if you want to, but then we're entangled. I mean, it's hard to disguise my disdain for it, because it just doesn't work operationally. Unless I'm actually in favor of a self-contained, but if someone showed up and said, look, these guys did mosaic securitization 6 weeks ago. This was done in the public bond market. We're going to do the exact same deal, with a few little nits. And then here's, the 12, signed documents from the last deal. We're basically going to clone it. That works. I'd be like, that's awesome. But if you don't come with some serious level of detail, I don't know how Maker is going to call it self-contained. I mean, it's a joke. It's just because no, self-contained, to Christian's point, means bringing, probably at least 5 or 6 drafted documents ready to be signed with all the terms filled in. Anything short of that, and you're kind of telling Maker, you're village idiot capital. I'm going to give you, a few 5% of the terms, and then everything else I'm going to fill out on my own. Or we don't know how to process it because we have no process. So you can hear my frustration, but I actually kind of wish it would have went, because it would have been, people sometimes need to see just how crazy the outcome is, and I think it would have been very interesting.
And Kianga, Kianga and Colin had 2 questions, so I'm just going to try to address them. Regarding the question Kianga had regarding Oasis Pro saying that they are flexible on many key terms and open to what the community proposes. It struck her that we did not want to be in a position of proposing key terms. Yeah, spot on. And because if we propose key term, it's not our job. We don't have the resources to do it. And I think that's where the frustration lies in a way, because I think for the first time, if I'm honest, the applicants are now facing a real world finance team that has a level of experience and
I was going to say confidence.
And confidence in asking questions. And I've said, I haven't said that, on like in a public forum like this, but I've been doing this 25 years. I'm happy to have any debate with anybody on any agreement on the forum all day long. And if I'm wrong, I have no problem changing my mind. Somebody tells me, I've worked with enough partners who've beat me up over the years that, my level of, I need to be humble. So if somebody understands something different, can point out a better way, I'm for it. And if you want to have that discussion on the forum, I'm all for it.
God bless it.
Let's do it. But I agree with you, Kianga. I mean, the applicants need to have their stuff together. They need to be better organized. They need to be more thoughtful. We need to be reactive. And we're not in a position, and I'm having this issue now. I'm looking at a deal, looking at their documents, and I've got my first question is, have you gotten an enforceability opinion on this from a New York lawyer? Because I got questions. That shouldn't be us. We don't need to be doing that.
I mean, Christian, I'd say it's not our job to turn their wish list into a well-structured term sheet.
So, Colin, you had a question about self-contained MIP versus MIP6. Why do we like? Oh, I'm not sure. And why do we like self-contained versus MIP6? I don't know that we have a preference. I think the self-contained MIP, if done properly, is theoretically, if done properly, and we can define what properly is, it is probably the least intensive for real world finance and legal. And what I mean by that is that if, and I want to define properly, a properly structured self-contained MIP would include all the draft documents so that we could see what the deal looks like, right? A self-contained MIP should be a transaction in all of its glory. These are the documents that we're going to sign. And what it does is it forces borrowers to come to us with documents that are balanced, because they know if they're not balanced, I'm going to call them out on it. Eric's going to call them out on the form, just like we've been doing. And you know, we're trying to force better behavior from the applicants, and having full transaction documents that are balanced. You know, yeah, Christian Peterson can quibble about, you know, a materiality qualifier before one word here in this clause, or gee, I'd like this additional than a default in that clause. But I know that's not my job. My job is to look at it and say, on balance, is this a reasonably structured deal? And is it reasonably protective of maker? And we should be forcing people to come to maker with those deals. We shouldn't be having to say, look, you know, stop trying to screw us over.
Christian, because one thing I'd say I like self-contained MIPS in theory, but I think it would work best on middle of the fairway assets that have some fairly recent market execution. So it's very clear what a market is, you know, and how it's done. I mean, if it's a subprime auto where there's 3 comparable deals done in the last 3 months, you know, I could see someone putting something all together. And there might still be a handful of points we push on, but you know, people know roughly what market is. But even then, I will say there's a range of what's aggressive versus conservative. And even when both sides know what they're doing, there's some arguing over where you want to be in the middle and trading on horse trading on what they care more about versus what we care about. I mean, but it can work, but it really needs to be a standard collateral with recent execution that's very transparent and the market understands it. Because otherwise, I think as self-contained MIP folks have been seeing, like the first thing I'm asked, my first 2 questions are going to be, one, what's the market, you know, where would this execute in the real world market in terms and pricing? You know, and I mean, and if you can't answer that question, I mean, I think that you should go away and learn it, because I mean, that's part of your job to present something. And if you don't know, you should get an investment banker, you know, and because in a sense, when you're asking us to do that, for companies, there's companies that know their market well, and they'll come straight to borrowers or lenders, but there's also companies who don't know it that well, and they hire an investment banker who's an expert in that asset and knows which lenders are interested. You know, they've typically charged a 1% to 2% fee of the money raised. You know, I mean, we're not charging that fee, but when someone comes to us who doesn't really know what they're doing, I feel like we should be charging that 1% fee, and Christian should be charging $1,000 an hour to give them advice. And, you know, they're trying to go skinny, you know, and use us as their outside experts because they don't have the expertise. You know, again, they're not really showing up with a professional, serious proposal where they've done their homework. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And Kianga, I think to that point, we're spot on where guys need to have done their homework and bring a real presentation. I mean, otherwise it feels like it's a big waste of everyone's time, including theirs. You know, because like usually in most transactions, even when they're fairly esoteric, there's going to be some comparables out there, and there's going to be some ways to think about it. And you're not always going to agree on both sides, but you can start to think about, all right, you know, these last couple deals are close enough. You know, let's see what market might be, you know, and work on it together. You know, it's like, but if you haven't done that homework, we don't even like know how to engage with you, quite frankly. You know, I mean, it's like we could be like a real jerky New York hedge fund and say, fine, 15% interest rate, 10%, you know, 20% advance rate. You know, we could jam them the hell out of them, but that's not the maker ethos. And so we don't want to be jammed, and we don't want to jam them. So it requires kind of the meaningful interactions of 2 knowledgeable parties.
Yeah, I think that it's these are a couple of great points in there. I think Eric and Christian on the self-contained MIPS. I think it almost feels like in I guess a mature real assets actually environment within Maker. Part of the ecosystem could be kind of a self-contained MIP as kind of like as a destination, and the problem that we have right now is that it's how to get there. So maybe there is a lesson learned, I think, from what we've seen with the self-contained MIPS, is that they use this, I guess, governance mechanism, which is called, self-contained, because MIPS are very modular in the way that they actually provided. But I guess the requirements, legally and commercially speaking, and the understanding of what that should be to be as self-contained as possible, these are not were definitely not ticked, I think, with the ones that were proposed in the forums. And therefore, the definition of self-contained was something that was actually not clearly laid out in that sense, which would actually reduce a lot the work that the team would have to do if they were, I guess, reasonably drafted and reasonably thought through. One question that I have, though, and utilize, I think, some of the some of the audience that is in here is, and that we haven't touched at all, is what, from a technology standpoint, does actually self-contained means. And we've got David and Robert in the room, and I don't know if you guys wanted to have a comment on this topic.
Hey, just before we transition on that,
ahead.
Will, I just had a quick question back on the risk or just the self-contained. And I thought the answers were good. The follow-up I had was that my view was that the self-contained MIP may have a different format and process for each self-contained MIP, which is why I thought the MIP6 would be the preferred route, Eric and Christian.
Look, I mean, if we're not gatekeepers, right? So if somebody wants to do a self-contained MIP, there's nothing that prevents them from doing it. We know what the MIP6 process is, and let's be honest. I mean, if you look at what on the slide, what it says, this kind of prioritization, right?
Yep.
It jumps to step 5, and then it says the domain collateral assessments are created and contain in-depth evaluations of the collateral types. Okay, well, we can only do that, right? We can only do an in-depth evaluation of the collateral type and a risk assessment if the deal is complete. So if your self-contained MIP isn't complete, well, then we can't do that work, because how do we do an in-depth evaluation of something that's not complete? So, I mean, we know MIP6 because MIP6, it doesn't require, there's a process by which applicants, and we've identified the process by which applicants, hey, these are the types of things we would like to see for purposes of a complete application. Yep. And we have some standards that we can benchmark and say, okay, did they meet, did they address any of those issues at all? But with the self-contained MIP, it was a bit open-ended. Like I said, I don't have really an issue with it. It's just, if you want to go that process, that's fine. We'll do our best to comment on what we have. But my point is, if you want to be successful with your self-contained MIP, the way that you're successful, in my view, is to come with something that's fully baked and fully complete in the middle of the road, because then you tie our hands.
No, right? Totally. But
I mean, because then you're tying real world finance's hands, because you can say, look, I gave them an agreement that was balanced, middle of the road, fully baked, fully thought through. All the pricing is there. What do they have to complain about?
Right. Right. But here's and this is where I'll leave it, right? Is like, if you had to look at, let's say you had 10 fully baked deals in front of you that had all passed all of the MIP 67 requirements as like a first step. And then you had 5 that were MIP 6s and you had 5 self-contained MIPs. Are you telling me that the RWFCU would rather see 5 self-contained MIPs or 5 MIP 6s? Or what would you prioritize, or what could you be more efficient in looking at and do your job better if you had to look at one over the other?
So from my perspective, as a lawyer, it's much easier to look at a full set of documents because then I know what I'm looking at. I'm not saying necessarily, on the Mozambique LNG project, for instance, which was a $16 billion project financing, our term sheet was 350 pages.
Mm-hmm.
That was the term sheet. That was going to take me a long time to go through a term sheet that's 350 pages, right? But if you come with a set of documents that's complete, yeah, it's going to take me time to get through it, but at least I know what I'm working with. Do I, in terms of it, that would be solely, and I'm responding solely on efficiency,
Right.
Because you've done the work, presumably, and all we're doing is checking. Does this look like they've done the work, and is Maker being reasonably protected and getting reasonable terms and the structure? It may take me 3 weeks to look at 1,000 pages, but okay, that's fine. I know what I'm dealing with. Whereas with the MIP6s, it becomes an iterative process, right? Because we don't prepare the documents, the borrower does. And if the borrower sends us documents that are middle of the road, thought through, and good borrowers will say, hey, good borrowers will know what some of our issues as much as struggles. Some of the issues that we struggle with, like the DeFi real world integration point, the questions, which we're going to publish something here in a week or so, just not decision making, but recognizing that real world assets are a lot different than crypto collateral, where unfortunately it involves human beings, and human beings basically result in lots of decisions needing to be made. Some type of delegated authority to a group, or some persons to do certain actions, and what those actions are, we're going to try to identify. If an applicant comes to us and say, okay, I've got a fully deal baked, and I know what your struggles are because I've been following the forum, I've been listening to these videos. I know what you've been saying. Here's how I would propose to handle it. What do you think? Great. Yeah, that would be good, because then they will force us, me in particular, to have a conversation. Look, I don't. Half of this time we're making, at least as the interaction with Maker, we're making it up, right? It hasn't been done before. That's why this is all hard. A lot of these issues have never been done before. So if they come to us with a proposal and a willingness to say, hey, how does this work? For me, it's great, because that may be the key that unlocks all sorts of other problems. Maybe it isn't, but maybe working together and collaboratively, we can find that key. So I'm okay with either one, frankly. It just depends.
Hey, Christian, can I take on that? I
Yeah,
think
sure.
in theory, the self-contained can work. I think it's hard, because it's almost asking not only for perfection in the execution, but perfect knowledge of what Maker wants, perhaps above and beyond what Maker itself knows. So it feels like you put a tremendous amount of risk on the person proposing it to do all this work. And then Maker doesn't say, one, they just don't like the deal. We don't like that asset, go away. Or, that doesn't really meet our DeFi needs. We need to do something different here, which is a perfectly fair thing to say, because we don't even know what our, kind of perfect structure is. So it feels like it's way too much risk. If someone asks me what they should do, I'd be like, you're better off doing MIP6 at this point. If we get a really well-oiled process and it's very clear what our box is, I think maybe that could work. But boy, you're taking a ton of excess execution risk, I think, by doing it right now. Like now, maybe you get to a MIP6 and there's several things in the community or we don't like and say, well, we want it more this way. And then, you got to do it iteratively as opposed to baking the whole meal. And then someone says, wait, this is fish. I want to have meat.
Totally.
That's an immense risk now is my sense.
I agree.
Yeah, but that's not, I mean, but if somebody did that, I guess my point is if somebody did that and wanted to take the risk and came to us with a full set of documents, that's fine. That's not our call.
But I think they need to think about their workload and the chance of success given how much effort they put in.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I hate to see people wasting their time.
Hopefully that covered your question, Colin. So, and I think actually there's another aspect that is a process related aspect. So a self-contained MIP application from a governance standpoint puts the kind of actually it does put actually the control of prioritization on the borrower because then the teams essentially have like the governance cycle to give any sort of feedback back to the borrower. And as you know, like the governance cycle for MIPS actually evolves from being a application in RFC, which has to be there for 4 weeks or so, then actually moving to formal submission, and then actually moving into actual voting. So that aspect of the of the governance cycle puts on any team, and whether we're talking about like one team or 10, actually a response cycle, but that response cycle is not a guidance cycle when it comes to self-contained MIPS. Is talking about here, like if you already know that you want to cook meat and you know exactly what the meat looks like, and you have all the documents, you just post them, and actually the teams have essentially that 4 week plus, essentially the 4 weeks to give a view on that application before it moves on to voting, because there's no way of really knowing whether the applicant is going to formally submit that application in the very next cycle that it has the right to, or will wait for 2 cycles for the whole thing to be baked. So it puts that responsibility on giving back that to the core units actually working on it. But the core units don't really have much of a say in terms of prioritization. And if there is more self-contained MIPS that there is actually capacity to do the work, then it is likely that the core units will not be able actually to give any view on that application before it actually goes through. Say if you had like 20 of those applications and all of them with a possible way of going through from RFC to formal submission, there is a possibility that some of those applications would never actually get a view, at least in like current capacity. I'm saying that it doesn't talk about future capacity, but in the current capacity, that would be the case. Yeah, Robert, do you wanna jump in? I think kind of like coming back to a bit of like the technology aspect of.
Yeah. What was the question? I'm here making lunch, so
yeah. No. So I think the question was on the self-contained MIP. What kind of, I guess, expectation, even if you guys had actually that conversation internally or not, would be actually from a technology perspective.
We actually don't have any commitment unless it's prior negotiation, conversation, and agreement with the core unit. I can't speak for PE or oracles. I can only speak for CE, but unless there's an agreement and that's publicly stated, we can look at it and say, oh, that's interesting. Now, what we have posted in the forums is that if a self-contained MIP does come through the process and it is voted on, then we will consider it greenlit. And part of that next step in the process would be to figure out where does it fit in the priority, given everything else that we're working on. When I say everything else we are working on, I'm talking about collateral across, both on-chain and off-chain.
Right. So that would essentially mean that kind of like you wouldn't, from your point of view, kind of be solving the actual self-contained kind of label that it proposes from like a technology implementation point of view, is to would still actually have to go through, suppose, like technology feasibility or technology feasibility or architecturing of how it's going to be proposed. Is it a MIP21 or a customized MIP21 or whatever the model that actually follows?
Well, see, now you're hitting on an area, which is that we try to educate applicants that we're available to help them, well, both to help them understand the process as well as the technology that might be used for their particular need. And so it's an outreach, and people are learning to find us. Colin and I had a great conversation yesterday around this, and we really encourage people to reach out to us. And when we can do that, we can explain the pros and cons of the process. And then also, based upon the type of technology or the type of collateral that individual applicants might be looking at, we can then say, hey, this technology might be more beneficial to you. And if they still decide to do the self-contained MIP, that's okay. At least, hopefully, at least they'll listen to the recommendation for the technology, and at least ask for that inside of the MIP. But what we've seen is that the MIPs that have said that we are going to do the work or suggested somehow that we've agreed to do the work, that is not the case for any of the self-contained MIPs that have been proposed. Or actually anything that's been proposed other than something that follows the same collateral onboarding process where we say if it's prioritized and if it's the next work we pull in, we agree to do the actual implementation, assessment, and technical work.
So hypothetically then, if for any reason, like a self-contained MIP was essentially kind of like had all of the agreements like drafted, and from a risk commercial point of view, they were like fully baked from a technology implementation, they would still kind of not being kind of like a bucket of self-contained. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, because what I step back and say, okay, if I remove the dependencies on our just general governance process of 60 days essentially to drive through a MIP, okay, let me remove that. And what's the advantage of something coming to me that says they're 100% complete? Okay, that's helpful, I think. But I think in our experience, what we find, and Eric's comment was really helpful for me, to really think about you really take a big risk in saying you think you know everything at that moment in time, where what we're actually finding out is that we discover information and new information that we need for the implementation as we walk through the process. That's actually been more helpful for us. So SocGen was a great example of that. We got into that. Now, obviously, they had a token, which is a little bit different than just a vanilla MIP21. So we decided to work with that, and we learned so much by working with that. I think what you're going to see, though, is that the real-world assets are going to get a little bit more complicated. What I mean by that is that I think we're going to have a tendency to start moving functionality on change. I mean, we're already seeing that the MIP21 needs modifications, and we've agreed between our teams to start having those conversations. And as that happens, we have a bigger reliance on the business and technical side to assist us on how we do the implementation. Some of that might not be known up front until we get deeper into the conversations. So I'm not, I want to consider this because we're going through another major iteration on the collateral onboarding process, which will involve updating and adding to the MIP set. So I want to consider where this could be the case. Like, for example, is there a concept of a fast track? Well, yeah, I'd like to consider that, but I'd also like to understand what that means. At any point in the process with something as complex as the real world assets, we need the complete information at some point in the process. That's always going to be true. But, and so how would we do that in a fast track way? And what would that look like? I'm not sure, but I'm open for feedback.
But I think, Robert, if it is a self-contained MIP, right, with fully baked agreements, we'd still need someone from one of the legal teams for MakerDAO to look at it before we waste time, trying to implement it from a technical perspective.
Yeah, there's always going to be some, because we're going to ask some entity to say, is this okay? I mean, what's your assessment? And I say, okay. I mean, would you recommend we move forward with the deal? Because we need to have expert opinions. And if the answer was no, or yes, but that can heavily change the implementation.
Yeah, but I'm gonna ask a very edge question, because I'm trying to think about, is there a possibility in any foreseeable future, and you don't even have actually to answer that question, like with that view of the future, if the self-contained MIP from a business, legal, and even to an extent technical point of view, was actually self-contained, and I'm really working with hypothesis here, would actually even technology, or the current technology principles that actually apply to Maker, would they even allow actually that the borrower themselves or some sort of intermediary actually appointed by the borrower to actually even, deploy the contracts or develop any customization that are required for the contracts actually to be deployed on chain, or this would be kind of like a completely no-go zone? Because that's what I'm thinking about, because from a business and legal perspective, it's essentially kind of like self-contained. We are talking about they've deployed the legal contracts, essentially. They've written drafted agreements. It's just like the agreements are there to kind of having the last reviews, like as Christian was saying. But from a, the smart contract point of view, and possibly Oracle's perspective, is that even kind of a possibility that the borrower could have, say, an institutional borrower that has, teams of smart contract engineers that are highly qualified to do the work? Could they even kind of actually self-contain their technology implementation, or this is no way?
Well, you bring up a really good question, because there are some inherent limitations. I mean, not many people understand the spell writing process for the executive vote. There's some real inherent limitations there. And to have a full end-to-end solution, we'd have to address that as a DAO. And I'm not, believe me, I'm not throwing daggers at anyone. It's just that there are technical considerations that have to be met. And it's a very careful, thought out process that we follow today when we execute spells. So just keep that in mind. So outside of that, I would love to see us get to a point where part of CES and what I've been one of my thought processes for a while has been, how do we enable more projects, individuals, groups to be able to self-serve into this process. Right? Can we get to a point? And I actually think that there is an opportunity. And if we can define the correct legal and business structures and the processes there that work, I'm pretty sure from a technology perspective, if we have a really good understanding of the collateral, and we check our boxes in the way of liquidations and emergency shutdown and all those other things that we do, it's possible to have something that is more like a user interface. I always default to that. So for UI, you want to onboard some collateral, go here. I know that sounds a little funny, but
and I agree with you on that, Robert. So I'm going to jump in on that because that should be where we go, right? I like your description of being self-serve. I mean, that should be the objective. You know, the real struggle with real world finance is that it's not uniform, right? So there's one asset looks completely different than any other asset, and it would take us some time to actually figure out what a self-serve agreement looks like. But I think it could be done, and just would take time. And you know, I think and you know, the example that I always go back to is like if you're looking at leveraged loan financing in Asia, they use the APLMA loan agreement, Asia Pacific Loan Market Association agreement. That's a standard form. Everybody knows what the terms are. There's very little quibbling, and you know, you can do a multi-billion-dollar leverage finance in 2 weeks because everybody knows what the basic terms are. So I think there's ways to do that. I'm not sure that we have the authority to do that right now, but I mean, to me, that is probably one way. If we really wanted to make it self-serving, is a way to look at it.
Well,
That's doable.
there's an added piece to that, and I appreciate that, Christian, because I think that there are some changes in our industry as far as real world assets from a securitization and tokenization perspective, that as we move toward that, it's going to give us many more opportunities to further automate this process. And I've talked with a number of people on this call, so I think that there's probably a violent agreement to how do we move, you know, these functions that we're doing primarily off chain, move them on chain, and be able to have a system where we do have liquidity. There's marketplaces for these tokens, right, that do represent the real world assets. I think that's more the future that I'm talking about, because to automate, you know, the actual agreements themselves, I don't know. The legal industry hasn't figured that out to date, and I'm not quite sure they're going to be able to.
Do you want to take that on your that load on your back to actually to do that?
Oh no, but I mean, I would agree that they haven't, but they're not incentivized to. And I think when you go back and look at my presentation on the incubating legal and transactional services core unit, that is kind of my goal at some point. I mean, it's not going to be tomorrow by any means, but if we can make it automated, I think it's better. But that's a multi step process beyond the remaining time of this call.
I support you in your effort, Christian. Let me know how I can help.
Thanks.
On that note, I actually, Colin, I don't know if you wanted to jump in about the comment on MIP67, just to provide a little bit of flavor of, I guess, was it just like a general comment or a question or something in that? If you're still around. Yeah, so Colin was mentioning that thinks that the one thing that we're not addressing is that some MIPS will go through the work of meeting the MIP67 approach, while others will not. And it's important to somehow identify that and sharing the forum. But not sure whether actually the RWF core unit is comfortable in doing this. And that is, I think, complementary to that, comment that actually that he had looked into the 10 of the 10 MIPS MIP6s, and actually 3 of them had already actually spoken with the RWF core unit and met the MIP67 criteria. So I think, Colin, maybe the missing aspect between, I guess, MIP6 and MIP67, if there was not clear, I think in the post that was made for MIP67. So we're not, MIP67 is not there to propose a replacement to MIP6. So MIP67 is simply kind of giving a, I guess, an unspoken, I guess, explanation that might have been missing on the MIP6, which is about defining a high level process for engagement, and what actually expectation in terms of the methodology that was put together for structured finance transactions, which also MIP6 didn't have any attachment to it, just had like a set of, I guess, high level questions for the borrower to come through. And MIP67 essentially complements that by saying, this is what we're thinking about for fully a proposal that actually answers all of, or as much as possible, of the sections that are contemplated in that methodology. But yeah, but giving also I guess, an opportunity for the applications not to be, I guess, necessarily fully baked at the beginning, and that actually has a step there, which is around actually guidance on preparing that application, which I think most borrowers appreciate from what we've seen so far, and including some of those that actually have submitted actually self-contained MIPS, because they actually didn't consider fully what is it that actually entailed to submit a self-contained MIP. So MIP6
Well,
tries to
I
address that.
can, that's helpful and agreed on all points. I think the thing that I would encourage the group here to think about is whether the MIP67 is spoken or unspoken, right? And for me, it's very clearly spoken on this call, but I don't think it's spoken or clear to the community more broadly. What I'll be transparent about is the way we're coaching or grooming, or whatever the right verb is, for some of the groups that are preparing to emerge from centrifuge. I would think the process we're taking with them, or the guidance I'm giving them, is simple, which is just 3 simple steps. First, introduce yourself so that chatter can begin through the collateral onboarding process. Second, make sure that whatever you're proposing hits the majority of, if not all of, the MIP67 guidance and methodology, so that, to Christian and Eric's point, it is, quote, fully baked. And then after that, then a MIP6 or a self-contained MIP could then be submitted more formally. But I think there's weeks of work to do, both with the RWFCU and publicly in front of the maker community through an introduction and MIP67 adherence, that I would almost argue that any group, centrifuge or not centrifuge related, right, if they're coming through that process, I wouldn't see them really submitting a MIP6 or any self-contained MIP if they're not taking the 2 preceding steps. So that's what we're narrating, or I'm guiding and giving guidance to the groups that we work with. So let me know if I'm off base on my thinking there.
No, I think a lot of groups actually are coming together with some of those, like, direction towards actually a MIP6 application, where they just, before the MIP6 application is fully submitted, they ask some level of guidance whether the requirements that are contemplated in the methodology are met, and that's mostly where we're kind of giving some guidance for those groups to go forward. But it's of course, as anything within the DAO, it is a complementary guidance, if you will. They still, if they don't want to take any of the guys and actually still move just forward with like the draft of what the MIP6 is, then shall be it. The community is open to that approach as well. Just a guidance, actually, it's essentially the goal of the guidance actually is to help to fast track the process, if you will, because then there's some level of at least overview of it before it actually goes into the forums and the whole chapter actually starts. Oh, we've passed the top of the hour, so and I think some people actually are moving into others. I'll hold the thought there for Frank for next time around, so that actually we don't forget the observation around the Yave and Goldfinch, and we probably actually can also give a bit of like an update in there, but I'll leave that actually for our next meeting as well. So thanks everyone for being here for this office hours, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.
Thanks.